When Vladimir Putin first became president 24 years ago, in his inauguration speech, he promised to preserve and develop democracy and take care of Russia. Well, fast forward nearly a quarter of a century, and democracy here today is being curtailed. President Putin's rivals are either in exile or they're in jail, or in the case of Alexei Navalny, dead. And Russia's war in Ukraine is now into its third year. So, as Mr. Putin embarks on his fifth term in office, I asked Fiona Hill, a former White House National Security Advisor and Russia expert, how does the Putin then compare to the Putin now?
He's been in power for a quarter of a century. I think all of us are well familiar with that axiom that absolute power corrupts, absolutely, and especially over time. And the longer that Putin has been in office, obviously, the longer he's moved away from those very first precepts. In terms of democracy, Putin has defined it in different ways over time. He started to talk about managed democracy, a kind of democracy initiated from the top down at various points in terms of creating political parties. He moved himself out of the position of being underpinned by a political party or even a political movement over time. He presided over changes in the constitution that enshrined the president as the supreme leader with a vertical of power and him very much at the apex of it. He had his surrogate, Dmitry Medvedev, who was briefly president of Russia, and I think most of us have forgotten this by this point, extend the presidential terms out by another couple of years. So now he looks like he'll be with us not just till 2030, but even further beyond till 2036.
How much of this transformation do you think was inevitable? And how much is it the fault of the West? Did the West make mistakes which pushed Putin in that direction?
I think an awful lot of it is the weight of the system itself and the way that it's evolved over time. And I think the external environment, you mentioned mistakes that have been made, has become increasingly permissive for Putin to make these kinds of changes because there's been an evolution of change elsewhere. We've had the rise of strongmen leaders, not just in places like China or Turkey, for example, but inside of Europe as well. We had the presidency of Donald Trump and perhaps even the return of Donald Trump to the president, who's styling himself in the same mode as Putin, as a strongman leader. I think the cardinal mistake has been taking our eyes off the ball about how Russia was evolving in that larger context, that Russia no longer wanted to be part of Europe in the kind of sense of joining in European institutions. But a lot of the internal developments, those are developments that nobody from the outside could possibly affect in any major way. And Putin has used lots of events, for example, the war in Chechnya when he first came into office, terrorist attacks, and all kinds of other developments to basically strip away many of the checks and balances in the Russian system.
And now, in what direction is he taking Russia?
Well, in many respects, he's taking Russia in what, as historians would see, as a very traditional and typical way. Having been in power for so long, he seems to be styling himself as a modern-day Tsar. He's talking about the regathering of Russian lands, of course, the annexation of Crimea, war in Donbass, followed by the full-on invasion of Ukraine, fits right into that. Everything now, in terms of the symbolism, the way that he refers to himself, this Russia now forged in war for the future, is taking us back to these past patterns in Russian and Soviet history. Putin thinks of himself now as Vladimir the Great, as a Russian Tsar. He's been in power for a quarter of a century. He aims for much longer than that, maybe a third of this particular century and then beyond. And that's how he sees himself. He's even, I think, gauging himself in the terms of this longevity, as well as in the deeds and the acts that he undertakes.
To what extent do you think Vladimir Putin is going to be defined, though, by the war in Ukraine and how that ends?
I think this is now going to be the definitional issue. I mean, again, if we took ourselves back to a different period, the first two presidential terms of Putin, for example, that took us up to the financial crisis, back in 2008, 2009, before he stepped away to be prime minister, I think we'd have had a fairly favourable assessment of Putin, because he really did many of the things that he set out to do, which was stabilise the country politically. He made the country solvent again. And now the war in Ukraine, I would say going back to the annexation of Crimea back 10 years ago, has really dramatically changed that trajectory.
And is the Putin we see now the Putin that, we're going to get until the end? Is there any way back for him?
It very much seems like he has crossed the Rubicon. I mean, I wouldn't rule out completely the opportunities for change. It would have to come in a very special set of circumstances in which I think he would be able to claim some kind of victory and then try to retrench. Putin himself knows that loosening up, as of course Gorbachev did and Yeltsin did, could be very dangerous and is likely to be very dangerous for his own position. We have the Prigozhin insurgency, back a year or so ago as well, which for him is most likely a signal of what can go wrong when you're too permissive in your environment. We need to be prepared, for dealing with more of the same and trying to shift those calculations over time by showing our own resilience and resolve to push back.
We never talked about Brezhnevism. We never spoke about Gorbachevism or Yeltsinism, but people talk about Putinism. If you have an ism after your name, that kind of makes you special, doesn't it? Does that mean that Vladimir Putin has made a particular impression on his country and the world?
Yeltsin himself spent a lot of time trying to come up with a new ism. He even had task forces that you, Steve, probably remember, given your own longevity in Russia. I certainly do, from the 1990s. There was a search for a new Russian idea. And Putin has actually presented himself as the result of that search for a new Russian idea, saying, I'm it. Which is a very personalized, charismatic presidency, and the president being the pinnacle of the Russian power system. Now the question becomes, if we have Putin styling himself as a Vladimir the Great, as the new embodiment of Russian czars, or Joseph Stalin, because we had Stalinism, of course, and Leninism before that, but Putin doesn't like Vladimir Lenin at all. He doesn't like that kind of revolutionary bringing down the state approach. But the question becomes, just like after the death of Stalin, whether the system can be maintained and will be sustained without Putin at the center of that. And I think that is actually a genuine question, because there is nobody else with any kind of traction within the system, let alone name recognition internally and externally. Putin has become it. And, as they say, there can be no other at this particular point.